Your thoughts are just chemical reactions, and your brain was purely designed for survival. How do you trust it to tell you the truth? This is the Discussing Truth podcast, and we are discussing the three-pronged arguments against atheistic naturalism. Humans operate on the assumption that our rational faculties are reliable. We reason through things, deliberate through issues, and make arguments. Some claim to have reasoned themselves to theism or to God. Some claim to have reasoned themselves to atheism and to naturalism. Every single argument you make presupposes that our rational faculties are reliable. The issue is naturalism undermines rationality in three key ways. First layer of argumentation against atheistic naturalism is that naturalism cannot account for a reasoning process. Under naturalism, physical reality is all that has ever existed in a closed system. But physical reality is governed by the laws of physics, not by the laws of logic. Your brain is just made up of molecules that are colliding with each other and chemicals that are reacting. Those are not sufficient to get you from one premise to another, from the process of reasoning that if human beings are mammals, then a human being, maybe Jude, is a mammal. Logic is responsible for that. Chemical reactions and physical processes are not sufficient to ground that. All that happens is that your neutrons are firing, your neurons are firing, and those aren't sufficient to ground reasoning processes. What that means at the end of the day is that we've seen that naturalism cannot account for our reasoning processes. Someone could object that, oh, computers do that, and computers are a good counterexample. Even assuming that computers are reasoning in the relevant way, which they are not, and we'll get to it. Computers were devised by prior minds, right? Human beings designed computers. So what that means is that they do not successfully serve as a good counterexample. The second layer of argumentation against atheistic naturalism is that assuming evolution is true, it is aimed at survival and not truth-seeking. What that means is that there's a disconnect between the utility that exists there and rationality. For example, evolution might cause you to have superstitions or exaggerations that help you to survive, but those things are not necessarily aimed at equipping you with knowledge or aimed at helping you to arrive at the truth. What that means is that we can't know for sure if our rational faculties are providing us with truth, and on that basis, naturalism undermines rationality. The third layer of argumentation is the most sophisticated, and so I want you to pay attention. The third layer of argumentation is that the very nature of thoughts require that they are immaterial. When you think about physical objects do not intrinsically represent anything else. For example, a tree cannot be about a rock unless human beings come together and decide that whenever we see this tree, it should symbolize a rock. So we remember the rock on the basis of our agreed interpretation imposed upon it. But the tree in and of itself does not represent a rock. It doesn't change when you begin to have like blotches of ink on a sheet of paper. It's like you have D-O-G on a sheet of paper. Those things do not inherently represent dog. They only represent dog insofar as human beings have come together and have agreed that whenever we see these inscriptions, they should remind us of the concept of a dog. Why is this important? If physical objects do not in and of themselves represent other things, but our thoughts in and of themselves represent other things. For example, you think of a triangle, and in and of itself, it directly represents a triangle. It means our thoughts cannot be physical. Our thoughts have to be immaterial. But if you think this is a trick argument, think about it. If our thoughts are actually physical, which part of the brain are our thoughts stored in? Because remember that we have infinite thoughts that we could contemplate on. We think about so many things over the course of our lives that we access via memory. Where exactly are they stored? You could say, oh, neurologists have discovered that when people think, there are neurological patterns or activities that happen in their brain. But remember that these activities are not identical to the thoughts themselves. If they were, then we could use machines, etc., to identify the specific thoughts in your brain and say, okay, this is the particular thought. Those things are just evidence that thinking is going on. not that the thoughts in and of themselves are resident in your physical brain. Why is this important? If our thoughts are not physical or our thoughts are not material, that is a big blow to atheistic naturalism. What that means is that one of the most vital components of the reasoning process inherently falsifies atheistic naturalism, and on that basis, atheistic naturalism cannot be true. Having examined these three fatal blows to atheistic naturalism, we have to ask ourselves, what then do we need to be able to trust that our rational faculties are reliable? Number one, we need to know that our rational faculties are aimed towards seeking truth, and number two, that they come from a rational source. Because if they are not aimed towards seeking truth, then we can't be sure that we are arriving at truth. If they are not designed or coming from a rational source, then we can't trust that our thinking processes or our minds are rational, because rationality cannot be trusted to come from non-rational sources. So what does the ultimate source of our rationality or reliable faculties look like? Number one, it has to be a mind or intellect of some sort, because you've already seen that rationality cannot come from non-rational sources. Even for computers, the reason we trust that they are going through rational processes, if they are, is because they were designed by human beings who have prior rationality. Two, the source of our rationality must be immaterial, because we've already seen that matter cannot account for rationality on three different layers. And then three, it has to be cosmic or grand on a certain scale or in a certain sense, because it's the source of all rationality, or it's the source of rationality across the cosmos. Why is this particularly important? This doesn't necessarily prove Christian theism, but it seems to lie within the sphere of theism, which is way away from naturalism. So theism of some sort, upon this argumentation, has to be true. Now let us consider the most obvious rejoinder that is likely to be leveled against this argument. It doesn't deal with the structural arguments, but it tries to offer a counterexample. That is the way computers work. The idea is that computers are purely physical, but they go through like logical reasoning of some sort and process mathematics. But what you have to understand is that computers, as I explained earlier with the example of how like thoughts work, produce symbols that have been pre-generated or programmed by humans, and then we come together and then interpret them as we have already pre-assigned meanings to them. So they do not inherently reason. They merely reproduce what they've been programmed to do. So to make it really simple, think of a calculator. When you type or tap 1 plus 1, and then it gives you 2, it is not thinking in and of itself of 1 plus 1. It doesn't know what it's doing. It's just following a mechanistic process. It doesn't change when it becomes more complex. It's just the same process at a more complex level, because thoughts are immaterial and therefore they can't exist in the computer. But the second thing is, even the rational processes that the computer seems to follow are processes that were designed by a prior existing mind or prior existing minds. What that means is that it confirms the claim that a prior existing mind has to have created all that we see with minds. So that is the computer counterexample, and it doesn't work. The second counterexample, or the second rejoinder or response, could be that we do not necessarily need a grounding for intellect, but you could have an infinite regress where this particular like mind or physical mind depends on another and depends on another and depends on another, and there's no stopping point. But this is a really fallacious argument. The reason it's fallacious is that if you have an infinitely long train, it will never move because it requires an engine to move. So the fact that it is infinitely long in and of itself doesn't generate that movement power for it to be able to do what it has to do in terms of movement. In the same way, even if you have like an infinite collection of physical minds that are stretching back into the past, because rationality is derivative in this case, there has to be an ultimate source or ground. If there is no ultimate source of ground, then that whole rational chain will not begin in the first place. So infinite regress cannot be a solution to this argument. In conclusion, We have seen that the arguments from reason defeats atheistic naturalism and then points towards a creator mind, or what we could call God. If you have any comments, you have any questions or disagreements, the comment section is open. Feel free to drop the comments. But I'm going to link to sources in the description below, because this conversation is a really interesting conversation that is active in academic and philosophical circles. You have people like John Searle, we have people like Alvin Plantinga, we have people like Victor Reppert, we have people like Thomas Nagel, who are contributing to these conversations. They are really competent philosophers who are up there in academic fields. And so I'm going to link to sources in the description below. And I trust that if you like this video, you're going to like, subscribe, and share. I'm Kwesi Kunedu. This is the Discussing Truth podcast. See you some other time.